We continue now at the top of Daf Ches Aleph in Meseches Bava Basra. This is Bava Basra Daf 98a. The Mishnah continues, if a seller says to a buyer, Mevusam ani mocher lach, I'm selling you wine that's mevusam, that's spiced. And the Rashbam explains, Mevusam sheyiskayim kederach hamiskayim, and what that means is, it's wine that's going to last. So then chayiv lahamid lo ad ha'atzeres. So then the wine has to last until atzeres, until Shavuos. And the Rashbam says, ad ha'atzeres, aval lo min ha'atzeres va'elach. We don't expect that the wine is going to last beyond atzeres, beyond Shavuos. Shechom tekufas tammuz, because the summer season is very hot. Mekalkel afilu yayin mevusam. That can spoil even yayin mevusam, but it has to last at least until atzeres. And the Mishnah continues, v'yoshin, let's say the person says, I'm selling you old wine, so mishal ishtakit, so then we expect that it's going to be from the previous year. And umiyushin, if he says, I'm selling you aged wine, mishal gimel shanim, then we expect that it's going to be 3 years old. And the Rashbam explains, v'yoshin v'mocher lo yayin yoshin, if he sells him old wine, yitin lo mishal ishtakit shana hamukdemes lezu, he gives him wine from the year previous to this one, from the year before, shanu omdim buf, meaning from the year previous to the one that we're in right now. Essentially, he gives him last year's wine. And then if he says that he's going to give him miyushan, which is aged wine, mishel shaloshanim, that's 3 years. What does that mean? Mishana dekodem eshtakid, that's the year before last year. Dehavalu gimel shanim im shana shanu amdimba, that's going to be 3 years, counting the year that we're in right now. Really, essentially, the Rashbam is saying it means wine from 2 years ago. It's called 3 years because we're counting the year that we are in right now. And the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina, Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina says, Lo shanu el bekankanim de lokeach. When the Mishnah says at the beginning, on the previous Amud, that the seller is not responsible if he sells wine to the buyer and the wine goes bad, that's only if he pours it into the jugs of the buyer. Aval bekankanim de mocher, but if he gives it to the buyer in the seller's jugs, in his own jugs, so then Amar lei, so then the buyer can say to the seller, Hachamrach, this was your wine, v'hakankanach, and these were your jugs, and therefore it is your fault, and you are responsible. And the Rashbam explains, Lo shanu deinu chai b'achroyu, so the Mishnah only taught that the seller is not responsible. Ela bekankanim de lokeach, that's if it's in the jugs of the buyer. Shekibel halokeach hayayin b'chev Yosef. The buyer received the wine in his own barrels. The ikol ameimar kelev garmu, then already we can say that it was the vessels of the buyer that caused the wine to go bad. And the Rashbam notes, Umiyu Seifa de Katani, nevertheless, the end of the Mishnah, the next line of the Mishnah, which says, V'im yadua v'chulu, it says, let's say it's known that this seller's wine in general goes bad, so then we say the seller is responsible. So Hasam lekal ameimar klei halokeach garmo. There you wouldn't say that the vessels of the buyer caused it. Da'anon sahadi shahayayin ragal b'kach, because we're already witnesses, meaning it's a known fact that this wine generally does spoil of this particular seller, and that's why the seller is responsible, even if it's in the vessels of the buyer. And the Rashbam continues, Avol bekankanim de mocher, again, if it's in the kankanim of the mocher, so then we say that the seller is responsible, because motzi amar le lokech, because then the buyer can say to the seller, afilu lizman meruba, even if it's after a long amount of time, hachamrach v'hakankanach, it was your wine, it was in your own vessels, it was in your own jugs, devada yenach v'kelech garmu, because certainly it's your wine and your vessels, that's what caused it to go bad. Tisvira lay, and the idea over here is that Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina holds to be a mos habatzer haviyayin mekulkal kvar, that really already from the time of the harvest it must be that the wine is bad. Essentially, all of the discussion over here revolves around the fact when you have wine that goes bad while it's with the buyer, was it really bad all along? And so here we're saying that's exactly the case. It was really bad all along. It just wasn't clear until this particular time when it actually turned to vinegar. Like we say in Ezo Neshech, already from the beginning, it was in its state either as wine or vinegar. And that's what it says over there in Babba Basra. And so therefore over here as well, that's what we're saying. That's why the seller is responsible if it's in his vessels, if it's in his jugs, because really all along it was problematic. That's what Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina is saying. And the Rashbam notes that not everybody agrees, as we saw earlier. Rav Damar Lael. Now Rav, he said earlier, Kol Shlosha Yamim B'Rishos Mocher. He said that for the first 3 days, it's the responsibility of the seller, but not after the first 3 days. So Ikal Le'ukmei Masnisin. So according to him, we can say the Mishnah is talking Bekankanim de Lokech, where it is the vessels, the jugs of the buyer. Ve'afilu Toch Shlosha. And even within 3 days, we're going to say that since it is in the vessels of the buyer, even though it is within the first 3 days, still we're going to say that the buyer is the one that's responsible. Or we can say, according to Rav, that it's in the jugs of the seller, and then after 3 days, the seller will no longer be responsible. That's why the seller is going to be pater after 3 days, because again, according to Rav, it's within the first 3 days only that we say the seller is responsible, that we say that it was bad all along. But the Gemara continues, V'chi kan kanim democher, but even if it is the jugs of the seller, and we're saying the seller is responsible in that case, why should that be? My have it, what difference does it make that it's the jugs of the seller? Lei molei, let the seller say to the buyer, Lo iboylach l'shahuya, you shouldn't have delayed, you should have drank it right away. The fact that you delayed is what caused the problems, and why should the seller be responsible even in that situation? And the Gemara answers, Lo no tzrich, it's necessary, Diyamar leila mikvah, that the buyer said to the seller that he was buying the wine for cooking purposes, so it was obvious that there was going to be a delay, and that's why we say the seller is going to be responsible if it is his vessels. But the Gemara continues, Why was Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina forced to say that our mission is talking about in the jugs of the buyer, and that's why the seller is not responsible? And then saying that the case is that he's using it for cooking, and that's why if it's the jugs of the seller, so then the seller is responsible. But why not just say, let him just say that we're talking about the jugs of the seller, and then say that the buyer never said he was going to use it for cooking, and that's why the seller is not responsible, because the seller is always not responsible since he can say, you should have used it right away. Why is it that Rabbi Yossi Reb Chanina is assuming that the buyer made clear that he was using the wine for cooking? And the Gemara says, Rava says, Masnisin Kashise, the reason why it was assumed by Rabbi Yossi Reb Chanina that the case is where the wine is going to be used for cooking is because otherwise there would have been a difficulty in the Mishnah. To Katani, because it says in the Mishnah, Im Yodua Sheyeno Machmetz Hareza Mekachtos. It says if it's known that this particular seller's wine always goes bad, so then we do consider it to be a mistaken purchase. And so the Gemara says, Amai, now why should that be true? Leimalei, again, let him say to him, Loi Boyalach L'Shuya, you shouldn't have delayed. If you would have drank it right away, it wouldn't have been a problem. Rather, don't we see from here that he said to the seller that he was using it for cooking, and the Gemara says, indeed, you see that this is the case. And the Gemara continues, Upliga de Rav Chia Bar Yosef, and this approach argues with the approach of Rav Chia Bar Yosef. Diyam Rav Chia Bar Yosef, because Rav Chia Bar Yosef says, Chamra Mazla Demari Garim, when wine goes bad, we assume that is the bad fortune of its owner, and that's why the seller is never going to be responsible, regardless of what vessels it's in. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, V'af ki ayayin boged gever yohir v'gomer. He's darshaning this pasuk in Mishlei to mean that the wine rebels against the arrogant owner, essentially, again, that it's the mazel of the owner that causes the wine to go bad. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Mori says, Hai man de yor, if somebody's arrogant, afilo ha'inshei beisi lo makabel, he's not even accepted by the people of his own household. Shenemar, as it says, Gever yor v'lo yinve, the haughty person abides not. My v'lo yinve, what does it mean v'lo yinve? Ben nove shelo, it means in his own house, in his own home, he is not accepted. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Yehuda Marav. Rav Yehuda says that Rav says, Kol hamiskah betalis shel Talmud Chacham. Anybody who's arrogant and wears the talis, the cloak of a Talmud Chacham, ve'eno Talmud Chacham, but he's not really a Talmud Chacham, meaning he's acting like a Talmud Chacham when he is really not one. Ein machnisin oso b'mechitzaso shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We do not bring him in to the mechitza, to the area of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Ksiv hacha, it's written over here, v'lo yinve. It says again in this pasuk, yohir v'lo yinve. It says the person's arrogant and lo yinve. Uchsiv hasam, and it's written over there, el nevei kachech, it refers to the holy abode of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that's the idea that the person is not brought into the mechitza of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rava says, Haiman de Zavin lechavisa de chamra lechenva. If a person sells a barrel of wine to a shopkeeper, Adaita l'sabuya, and the understanding is that the shopkeeper is going to sell it little by little to the buyers in his store. V'takif apalgo atilsa, and then the barrel of wine goes bad when half of it is left, or when a third of it is remaining. So dinohu de mekabel lamine, the halach is that the seller has to accept the barrel of wine back, meaning to say he has to take responsibility. The seller has to take responsibility for the fact that it's spoiled, and not the shopkeeper. And the Gemara continues, and that's only true if the shopkeeper didn't change the area of the tap where the wine comes out of the barrel. But if he changed that barza so then no, we don't say the seller is responsible. Sometimes changing that tap can cause the wine to go bad, and therefore we say that in that case the shopkeeper is responsible. And furthermore, the Gemara says, we only say this in a case where the day of the market has not yet arrived. But if the day of the market arrived, there was plenty of opportunity for the shopkeeper to sell the wine while it was fresh, and he did not. So then no, we don't say that the seller is responsible, but rather the shopkeeper is responsible in that case. And the Gemara continues, V'yamar Rava, and Rava says, Haiman de kabel chamra daita de mamti le lefarvosa de val shafat. Let's say a person accepts wine on the understanding that he's going to bring it to the port of Val Shafat and he's going to sell it over there. And the case over here is that it's a case of Iska, where the person managing it and the person who owns the wine, they're going in as partners 50-50. They accept upon themselves 50% of the profit, but also they each accept upon themselves 50% of the loss. But there were specific instructions over here where the managing partner was supposed to bring the wine to this particular port. And then by the time he got to that port, Zol, so then the price of wine went down, and he wasn't able to make any money. So in that case, Dinahu de Makabele, so in that case, it's the responsibility of the owner. He has to accept the loss because he gave a specific instruction that he wanted it to be sold in that area, and so the managing partner had to take it to that area. The prices then went down. Therefore, the managing partner does not have to accept any amount of the loss in that case. And the Gemara continues, they had the following question, let's say it's not that the price of wine dropped, but rather the wine soured, it became vinegar. So then what would be the halacha? Would we say over there that only the owner takes responsibility, or there would we say that both of them share in the loss? Amar le Rav Hillel Rav Ashi, Rav Hillel said to Rav Ashi, Ki havon bei Rav Kahana, when I was by Rav Kahana, Amar Loni said to us, Chalalo, that in a case where it becomes vinegar, so then we don't say that it's fully the responsibility of the sellers, rather we say that it's both of their responsibility. The idea is that we say it's the mazel of both of them that caused it. Udelok Rabbi Yossi Reb Chanina, if you say like that, it does not follow Rabbi Yossi Reb Chanina, because Rabbi Yossi Reb Chanina would say, since it's in the vessels of the owner of the seller, therefore the owner would be the one that's responsible and not the manager. V'ika diamri, there are those that say, afilu cholanami makabel, that even if it goes bad, even if the wine goes bad, it's the owner who's going to be fully responsible, just like if the price drops. And come on, who would that follow? Rabbi Yossi Reb Chanina, again, that would follow Rabbi Yossi Reb Chanina, because it's in the owner's vessel, so he is the one that is responsible. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Yoshon Mishel Ishtaket, if a person sells old wine, so then that means to say that it's wine from last year. And the Mishnah went on to say that if it's aged wine, it means that it's 3 years old. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Ches Amud Beis.